Donald Swain Lewis was born at Banstead Hall on the 5th of April 1886. He was the son of Captain Ernest Lewis and Maria Jane Lewis. Now, Ernest had had a long career in the army. When he retired, he became the director of a new cooperative set up to sell high-quality goods to ex-army and navy officers at a good price. And this cooperative was called the Army and Navy Cooperative, and I'm sure you all remember the Army and Navy stores that later got swallowed up by House of Fraser. And he was a wealthy man as a result of his business interests. They'd opened their first department store in 1872, and they soon had branches all around the world, and they did very well. And the Lewises came to Banstead in the early 1880s to a relatively new house, only built about 10 years earlier, Banstead Hall. When they had dug the railway cuttings for the new Epsom Downs branch line, they had an awful lot of chalk left over and didn't know what to do with it. So they started building grand houses made out of this chalk, and then rendered it and then faced it with bricks eventually. And so there are several houses that were on the Brighton Road that were built in this particular way. Banstead Hall was one of them. It used to stand with its face on the Brighton Road, with a lodge on the A217, which is still there today. My parents-in-law actually live in the lodge, South Lodge, and there's still one of the surviving gateposts in their garden as well, with the word Hall on it, the one with the word Banstead having gone a long time ago. And this house was, there's now the site of a block of flats in Dunnymans Road. Little copse next to it, and if you go poking around with your toe in the copse, you can still turn up a few odd bricks and things in there from the time of the house. It was a very grand house. They also had a big domestic staff at the time. They had quite a few children. Donald, or Don as he was known to the men he served with, was the youngest of 5 brothers and had an elder sister as well. They moved away when he was about 3 or 4 years old. And as he grew up, presumably went to a prep school, and then he went to Uppingham School. After he finished there, he went to Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy. All 5 of his older brothers were all in either the army or the navy. He was treading a well-trodden path. While he was at school, 2 of his older siblings were serving in the Boer War. One of them very seriously wounded, and the other of them unfortunately lost his life in that conflict. After school, he went to Sandhurst, and after that, he joined the Royal Engineers as a second lieutenant. And he served with them for about a decade, being promoted to lieutenant. We don't actually know much of what he did in the Royal Engineers, unfortunately, in that time, until we suddenly find him again in 1912. The day after the Royal Flying Corps was formed, he qualified as a pilot at Brooklands. And he was obviously, he obviously wanted to fly, and he had the opportunity to do so with the Royal Engineers, because they, up until the Royal Flying Corps had formed, they were in charge of flying. They had the Air Battalion, as they called it, and that became the military wing of the Royal Flying Corps. He was probably working in the new field of wireless telegraphy, basically a radio set with a Morse key or a Morse buzzer that you could send Morse messages. Wireless hadn't been around for very long. But we had this idea that we could start putting these great big clunky kits that were absolutely huge, weighed a ton, had aerials that trailed behind something for 200, 300 yards sometimes. We had the idea that we might be able to start putting these wireless sets into airships, which is what we were flying at the time. And there had been some experimentation going on since about 1907. And we think Donald was probably working in the field of wireless, because he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, and very shortly afterwards, he joined the wireless unit. It was led by a chap called Major Musgrave, one of the very early innovators, who had a very small team that were working around him to implement these wireless sets that were being developed. They were trying to fit them into airships and into aeroplanes as well, while they were being developed, while new components and technologies were being developed all the time by civilians at the National Physical Laboratory, who were the civilian wing of the Royal Flying Corps. So some technological developments happened that enabled these wireless sets to be built small enough and light enough that they could be put in a plane, and the plane would actually get off the ground. And we're talking about 75 pounds worth of weight still, and that was considered to be light. And it would take up the entire observer's seat in a two-seat plane and also encroach into the pilot's seat as well. So these bulky things. So they had to have these big, powerful planes. They built some Blériot experimental planes to carry these wireless sets up in the air. And Donald and one of his colleagues, Baron Trevelyan James, B.T. James, could talk to each other across the airwaves at a distance of up to 10 miles, which was thought to be a world record at that time, using these new experimental sets. And they did much to develop this technology. Donald's job specifically was to take the wireless sets and try and adapt them for use within the planes and make them as rugged as they possibly were, while his colleague B.T. James would work on the actual procedures around how we would use this wireless communication. The department had the vision that eventually all aeroplanes would be equipped with these wireless sets, and the Royal Flying Corps had the foresight to already know in advance exactly what they would be used for. They knew they were going to use them for reconnaissance patrols, for liaising with the artillery when they were shooting, and for communicating with each other as well. So they had already mapped out, even before they had more than 2 wireless sets in the entire Royal Flying Corps, exactly what they were going to do. And they were right. They had excellent foresight. They knew, when war broke out, probably exactly how many squadrons they were going to need. They knew they needed more than the 8 squadrons we had at the time, one of which was still balloons. They knew that they would need at least 60 squadrons by the end of 1915, and production was geared up. When that estimate came to Lord Kitchener, he said, double it, and signed authority, and after that there was no objection from anybody, no shortage of materials, and soon there were 200 squadrons in the Royal Flying Corps. So from this small group of 100 men or so, we had an organisation of thousands by the end of the war. So as the crisis was brewing in Europe, it became obvious that we were going to go to war, and the RFC were mobilised a few days before war broke out. And perhaps not knowing that he'd ever come home again, Donald acted on the spur of the moment, and he obtained a special licence for marriage. And he married his fiancée Margaret at a church near their base in Farnborough on the final day of peace. At 11 o'clock that night, the 11th hour, our ultimatum to Germany expired and we were at war. Just over a week later, Donald was one of the early members of the Royal Flying Corps, 4 squadrons, to fly across the English Channel to their base near Amiens. They'd located as where they were going to hopefully operate from for the time being. His wireless flight, 3 planes, 3 wireless sets, 3 pilots and a small support crew were attached to number 4 squadron. Now, the trouble for them was that their wireless was in a very experimental stage. There was a lot of development that needed to be done. And the situation on the ground was changing very rapidly. So in the first few weeks of the war, the first month of the war, they didn't get the chance to show what they could do. And the first opportunity really came about a month into the war. It was the British had just started, 3 weeks into the war, the British had just started retreating from Mons, and all was in disarray. And we fought a delaying action, a rearguard action at Le Cateau. And that was primarily fought by 2nd Corps under General Smith-Dorrien. Now, on his flank was supposed to be the 1st Corps under Sir Douglas Haig, but they weren't there, and they didn't know where they were. They had to go and find him, and the only way they could do that, other than sending out cavalry patrols all over the countryside, was to send up some planes to go and find him. So 2 aeroplanes were dispatched from number 5 squadron, and a wireless plane, Donald's plane, was attached to them to report back as soon as they found Haig and delivered a message. And these planes flew to where they thought the troops might be, and they found a likely looking landing field somewhere near some British troops, and landed there. These two planes from 5 squadron landed there while Donald circled overhead. Now, unfortunately, they didn't realise that this ground was actually between the Germans and the British. Luckily, they managed to deliver their message to a cavalry patrol. But just as they'd done that, a German cavalry patrol arrived in the field, and they had to scarper pretty quickly, but managed to get away. But while they were down on the ground, Donald had lost sight of them, he'd lost track of them, and he had to circle, waiting for them to reappear, and all the time he was circling. And when he came back, his machine was full of bullet holes, a shell splinter, and he suffered his first wound of the war, and he'd been grazed on one of his fingers. It was probably the first of many lucky escapes that he had. He often made himself a sitting duck, really. He came home with his plane peppered full of bullet holes, even his clothing being torn by bullets at some times. So after this first exploit, a one-off special task, they began to settle into what their proper role was, which was observing for the artillery. As soon as we'd stopped moving around the countryside, as soon as the retreat had finished and the advance had started and we'd come up against a brick wall of German resistance, we could finally start putting these planes overhead, coordinating with all the artillery that we could start to mass behind us. And it was men like Donald and B.T. James that flew up there. They were on their own in their aeroplanes. They had to fly the plane, watch the ground, work the wireless buzzer at the same time, keep an eye out for enemy aircraft. And all the time they were doing this, they were being shot at. The original messages were sort of plain text message, left a bit, right a bit, back a bit, that sort of thing. You've hit them. But this was very, very inefficient. And one of the big problems that they had was that the maps they were using at the time didn't have any kind of coordinate system or any kind of gridding. So you might have to say, right there, half a mile right of the letter S in the word Ypres, or what have you. And it was very difficult. And once you got that, your artillery battery would fire at that spot, and then gradually the observer flying above would hone them in on that target until they started hitting near it. This is very, very inefficient, very difficult. You have to send all these messages while you're flying the plane. So what you needed to do was to strip that down and reduce that to a series of codes, if at all possible. And the way that Donald did this was he took a copy of one of those maps, or two copies of one of those maps, and he drew a grid on it. It seems like such a simple idea to number and letter that grid, but no one had done it in the army before. He gave one copy to the battery commander, took one copy up with him, and when the battery fired, he was able to say that it landed in square A1, or what have you, and he told them the battery target was in A2, so they could adjust their fire accordingly. So he only had to send very, very brief snippets of information back to them to very quickly get them honing in on those targets. He showed this map to some colleagues in the RFC, who then took it to the topographical branch of the army, and within months these maps had been adopted all across all branches of the armed services, and they were used throughout the war and beyond. Another innovation that they had was the Royal Artillery system of range finding was left a bit, right a bit, to me, to you. The infantry used to say 300 yards at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock or what have you. And B.T. James proposed that the artillery adopt this infantry system, the points of the clock, to indicate a direction of where the shot fell relative to the target. It's much more efficient, much more flexible. And while they were debating this, Donald came up with a better idea. He would implement James's idea, but he'd also add ranges into it. So what he did was he got a clear disc of clear celluloid, and he drew a series of concentric circles on it, and round the circumference he marked the hours of the clock, and then with each band representing a distance from the target, he would give that a letter. So A would be 50 yards and B would be 100 yards, and so on and so forth. And then he'd just overlay it on the map with the centre of it over the target that the artillery was shooting at, and he could just send back 12A to say that the artillery had overshot that target by 50 yards, for example. Very, very efficient, very popular, and with a few refinements, it became the system that was adopted for the RFC and the RAF for the whole of the rest of the war, and beyond that, well into the 1920s and possibly even the 1930s as well. Now, he spent the autumn of 1914 flying alone, as did B.T. James, above the skies, directing the fire of these artillery batteries. And as time went on, more and more wireless machines started to appear, and wireless observation became much more widespread. They were very much in demand. Even so, there were a very small number of planes. The battery commanders loved them because they could register on target 5 times quicker with a wireless plane than they could by the traditional method of just firing a flare when they were directly over the target, or flashing with a signal lamp, or anything like that. So as this became more popular, they could start to use these planes en masse, and they started to do that in the spring of 1915, the British engagements there. All these men were using these maps designed by Donald. They were all using these clear celluloid discs designed by Donald. They were all using this wireless equipment which had been tested and refined by Donald. And they worked to great effect in those engagements of 1915. Donald left the wireless flight that he was in. It was broken up as wireless became more common, and they wanted to spread their expertise throughout the RFC. So he joined another squadron, number 3 squadron, and he became the squadron commander very shortly afterwards in the spring of 1915. There were all kinds of other innovations happening at the time, and one of which was in bombing. The war had started off with bombs no bigger than you can hold in your hand, really, or hold about your person when you were flying. There were no bomb racks or anything like that on aircraft to carry big bombs, and the aircraft were too weak to carry the heavy bombs anyway. Or maybe hand grenades or even petrol bombs were thrown in the early days of the war. But bombing had come on a lot. The planes had got more powerful, they could carry more weight, and more precision was needed. So bomb racks started to be developed. And they needed some method of aiming these bombs other than just by doing it by eye. And so they developed bomb sights. And number 3 squadron, Donald's squadron, were testing and developing these bomb sights. And they took part in one of the first bombing raids, the first mass bombing raids in one of the engagements in the spring of 1915, the Battle of Aubers Ridge. And Donald reported back on the success of the sights. They could drop a bomb within 40 or 50 yards of the target they were aiming at from a height of 6,000 feet. Very impressive. He went on developing wireless within his own squadron, and after the engagements of spring, everything calmed down for a little while, and he was due some leave, so he was going to be sent back to England, but he knew there was a big show coming and he didn't want to miss it, and so he refused to go on leave and stayed out in France through the summer of 1915. And they had, the lines had been static for quite some time. We'd worn out our army trying to break that deadlock, and we'd had to wait for months for the new volunteers who'd just joined up on the outbreak of war, Kitchener's volunteers. We had to wait for them to be trained and then to come out to France to join us, and that didn't happen until the summer of 1915. So in September 1915, we were ready to try and break the deadlock. We had poison gas available for the first time in very large quantities. We had all these new men that we could use, and so we tried at Lewes, the mining town of Lewes, to break through, with a little bit of success, not much, but a little bit. Donald's squadron at the time were on artillery observation duties, and they flew throughout the Battle of Lewes over the battlefield there. Again, very effective at registering where these batteries were and sending their coordinates back to the battery commanders. Unfortunately, intelligence on the battlefield hadn't developed to such an extent, and so sometimes the battery commanders would refuse to shoot because they'd heard rumours or reports that British troops might actually have reached those locations by then, usually false, unfortunately. So there would be a lot of development going on with the reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance, that would help improve that intelligence. Donald's men were flying too high most of the time to actually see what's happening on the ground. They'd have to fly low was the eventual solution to that. But they trialled all sorts of things, like these great big strips of white cloth that the men would roll out on the ground as they advanced to mark their progress. Of course, the first thing that the infantry would do is throw out these great big heavy rolls of things they didn't really want to carry with them when they were being shot at. And they didn't want to stop and roll them out, so that was a bit of a failure. But all kinds of different things were tried, and he was again at the forefront of developing those sorts of things. He was sent home in the winter of 1915-16 to be given an easy job in command of a training squadron based at Northolt, which is now the longest continuously used airfield military airfield in the entire world, I believe. And he was there in the training squadron for just 1 month, probably champing at the bit the whole time to get back to France and agitating for it. And whatever he was doing paid off, because only a month later he was posted back to France, this time as a wing commander of the 2nd Wing. And they were supporting the whole of 2nd Army. Their job was primarily artillery observation, but also now he was responsible for fighters. Aerial warfare had developed. In the early days, you could fly around for hours without seeing another plane. Now they had all sorts of high-performance aeroplanes out there, which were very heavily armed, and they were fighting above the fields, the trenches all the time. One of the early days of his command at 2nd Wing, he recorded something like 23 fights, aerial fights in a single day amongst his men. There probably hadn't been 23 fights in a single month before that. He was flying a desk now as this wing commander, but he did still get in an aeroplane occasionally, and fatally, on the 10th of April 1916. At 10:47 in the morning, he took off in a marine parasol from Bellier Aerodrome. He was taking up an observer, Captain Gale, who was in charge of a battery of trench mortars, and he was taking him up to see to show him where he'd been shooting at and to see if see what success he'd had. They were flying at about 5,000 to 7,000 feet east of the town of Whitchurch, and were about 2,000 yards southeast of the village of Zandvoorde when they received a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell. The plane plummeted vertically towards the ground, broke up as it fell, and both men were killed, probably instantly. Donald was just 30 years old and left a widow. The second man that we're commemorating is Leslie Mitchell. Now, Leslie was born on the 31st of August of 1898, the son of James and Clara Mitchell. He was born in Dulwich. His father was a self-made man. He was the son of a carpenter, but he worked his way up from clerk to stockbroker. And by the time Leslie was born, he was quite a wealthy man. They came to Belmont soon after Leslie's birth, and they lived in a succession of 3 very large houses in Belmont, the third of which, Roselle in Burden Lane, they moved into in 1914. Now, Leslie probably attended a pretty good school. He was probably in the officer training cadets while he was there. On the outbreak of war, he was still too young to serve. He was a clerk at a firm of stockbrokers, Glanville and Eindhoven. But as soon as he turned 18, he volunteered for service. He wanted to serve as an officer, so he had to join the officer training cadets. So he had to join a senior division of officer training cadets, and he joined the University College of London's OTC. And they took in mostly their own students, but also some men who had been to OTCs in their schools but wanted to join and apply for a commission. So he trained with them for several months, and he joined the Royal Flying Corps in early 1917 as a 3rd aircraft man. After completing his basic military training, he went on to specialist flying training, spent several months in classrooms in places like Denham in Oxfordshire, before he finally got his hands on an aeroplane for real. And he passed his flying test at Cricklewood in the summer of 1917. After that, he was posted to a bomber squadron, number 83, just for a few weeks. They were based in England. He was just sort of learning to fly a proper military airplane rather than a civilian trainer at that point. And then on to number 94 fighter trainer squadron in East Anglia. Now, the pilots, any pilot that was on the Western Front that flew straight and level and didn't move around too much was going to be dead meat within probably just a few minutes. And so these pilots, these young pilots, were encouraged to perform manoeuvres. Stunt or die was the mantra of at least one instructor there. Unfortunately, it was often both stunt and die for these young trainee pilots. On his very first solo flight in an Avro 504J, Leslie tried to loop the loop. He was too close to the ground. He had absolutely no margin for error. He was only 500 feet up. And as he got to the top of the loop, the machine started to come down. It fell forward, and rather than try and go with the loop, he tried to fight it, or perhaps he fell onto the control stick. But whatever happened, he lost control, and his aircraft crashed upside down into the ground, and killing him instantly. He was just 19 years old, and he's, as I said earlier, he's buried here just outside in the churchyard in the family grave, and we'll be commemorating him tomorrow by laying a wreath at 11 a.m.
It is so important that we remember all of our servicemen who served in so many different capacities, so many different situations. We just bow our heads for a moment in prayer as we bring their memory before God. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to come together and to remember Donald and to remember Leslie. We thank you for their family lives, for their growing up, for the opportunities they had to learn and to enjoy life. We thank you that John lived in a world of cutting-edge technology from his time, where he was able to play a part in developing that they had and that we all have in the courage and the commitment of those who offered to serve and who served so courageously. We think today of the world in which we live and of our continuing need for peace. We pray that those who sacrificed their lives so many years ago may play a part in reminding us that there is a better way and that we should solve our problems in peaceful means. And we conclude our prayer with the words of the blessing which is used at World War Remembrance services. God grants to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth and all people, unity, peace and concord, and to us and all God's servants, life everlasting. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit be with you all, and remain with you always. Amen. Thank you so much for being here today, part of our remembrance, our continuing remembrance of the servicemen of Banstead in World War I.